Eric Schneiderman, New York State's Attorney General, is the people's lawyer. And while you may see him filing suit against scammers and con artists to protect the state consumers, there's a unit within the AG's office dedicated solely to protecting the interest of workers. Now, for nearly a decade, Terri Gerstein has worked on behalf of New York's working people, both in her former position as a deputy commissioner in the New York State Department of Labor and in her current job as the Labor Bureau Chief for the New York State Attorney General's office. Now, the Labor Bureau has recovered more than $27 million in restitution and damages for more than 20,000 workers who were cheated out of wages, all the while advocating for reforms at a national level even. Now we're happy to welcome her to BK Live's special on jobs and justice. Thanks for being here, Terri.
Thank you for inviting me.
So that is a large number. It's also a large job. So looking at the scope of what you do, what would you say is the split between being in court and really holding people to task for violations that may happen and making people aware of their rights to prevent those violations?
Well, we try to do all of that. We do file lawsuits. We also bring criminal prosecutions when the facts are really egregious. And also, I think that through publicity around the cases that we bring, there's a lot of public education of workers about what their rights are, as well as public education of employers about what not to do. And so we do hope that the cases that we bring, the investigations, cases where we get settlements, or whatever happens in those cases, we hope that it has a deterrent effect on violations and leads to greater compliance, which is our goal.
Yeah, whether it was just from ignorance of the law or being a bad actor.
Right, and and we've seen employers who fall anywhere along that continuum, and so we certainly, our goal is to get compliance with the labor laws, and it's been very gratifying to see the increase in worker protections over the past 4 or 5 years, paid sick leave, increases in the minimum wage, but it's also very important to have those laws actually enforced so that they're meaningful in people's lives.
So speaking of those lives and the way that people work, New York happens to be blessed with a lot of varied economies. Whether you're like upstate, we've got people picking apples, we've got a tech sector and startups down here. So looking at that landscape, where are the sort of fires that you're putting out the most in terms of our state's economy and working people?
Well, we've tended to focus over the last several years on trying to protect the rights generally of very low-wage workers. So we've brought cases, have gotten settlements, filed lawsuits against, for example, a number of fast food employers. We recovered $1.5 million from about 12 different Domino's franchisees, a similar number from Papa John's franchisees. We've brought cases involving construction companies. Some of our Skycaps, yes. We had a case involving Skycaps who are being paid as low as $3.90 an hour. And so that was obviously something that we wanted to rectify right away. So it's really been a broad range of industries, but again, we've tended to focus on the very lowest wage workers where possible. Although some of our initiatives have really spanned across a lot of different types of workers and industries. Recently, we announced that we'll be proposing legislation next year in the next legislative session regarding non-compete agreements where employers require workers to sign something saying they won't work for a competitor.
But when someone thinks of a non-compete clause, their mind immediately goes to these sort of Wall Street entities, or you've got trade secrets. I know your algorithms.
Exactly.
Not the guy
I know
at Jimmy John's.
Exactly. So that was something that was very surprising to us, as there does seem to be an increasing use of non-competes for a broader range of employees. And one national study found that as many as 20% of employees were subject to non-competes. So we did have the investigation involving Jimmy John's, which we resolved. We had another one involving a woman who worked for a company, a medical examinations company, that went and was taking blood samples from people for a life insurance company, and she got an offer of a better job and was unable to take it because of the non-compete, right? And so these are people who are not, we had another case involving low-level, new reporters at an internet internet news site. And so these are people, these are not necessarily the lowest wage workers, but they're rank and file, rank and file workers who are just working, living paycheck to paycheck. And the idea that they wouldn't be able to improve their lives and get a better job is just really anathema to the whole concept of economic mobility.
So we've been taking a deep dive into jobs and justice, and I wanted to know from your perspective, what is the largest threat, especially to folks who might be low-wage income earners or people who are just working for a living? If you look at the landscape, what is the biggest threat to people who are in that position?
I think that there are a lot of threats. I think that one thing is a lot of people don't know what their rights are. I think one key right that people have is the right to be protected against retaliation. I think people are very much afraid of reporting violations because they think they'll be retaliated against them. There'll be repercussions. Our office, when this does happen, has taken an extremely strong position, and we've managed to get people reinstated pretty swiftly when we learn that they're retaliated against for reporting violations. I think that the decline in unions in the private sector rate of unionization in the country is around 7%. New York actually has the highest, New York State has the highest rate of unions in the country. But I think that unions for decades, for century, have been really the backbone of protecting workers' rights. And I think that the difficulty that a lot of workers face in trying to get a union in their workplace is something that is very, makes it hard for people to assert their rights.
So that piece about non-retaliation is very important, especially when we're looking at an environment where jobless numbers have sort of risen just slightly and folks just want to hold on to the jobs they have. So do you have a little pearl that you can give to people to reassure them if something doesn't feel right or if they think their rights might be violated, how they might go about finding out if they are in fact and what a next step would be?
Well, people can call our office. There's also a number of different government agencies, the state and federal departments of labor, where people can find out about what their rights are. And if they do find that there's a violation, I think generally if you report them along with coworkers, if it's a group of workers taking action together, often that offers greater protection, and it's harder for an employer to take some kind of retaliatory action against a number of people instead of just one solo person acting alone.
Okay, so let's take a little bit of a victory lap here and talk about some of the things that you're proud of. This was something that was close to my heart when I was a Gap folding all those jeans when I was like my freshman year at Christmas break. This concept of being on call for your job, where you have to call in that afternoon or that morning to find out if you're working and what that can do to a person.
Right. So we learned that there are a lot of employers, but especially in retail, where workers have what are called on-call shifts, which means they have to call in an hour or two before the shift starts to find out if they're needed for that day. And it's a condition of employment. They have to do that. And New York has a regulation that if an employee, by request or with the knowledge or permission of the employee reports to work, the employee has to be paid for a threshold number of hours at the minimum wage. In retail, it's 4 hours. Right. And so we felt that if a worker had to call in, reserve the day, get childcare, forego other opportunities, whether educational or employment, that was reporting to work. If you have to call and be available, that's reporting to work. So we reached out to a number of national employers to give them our interpretation of this law and tell them that we thought it was problematic and that we wanted some information. And ultimately, we had some very productive conversations with them. They didn't agree with our interpretation of the law, but they did ultimately agree to stop using on-call shifts. I think a lot of them realized that regardless of the legality, that it was just not good for morale. It wasn't a good way to treat their people. And I think that increasingly there are some employers who are thinking this way, that are realizing that thinking of your workers as just another cost is not a good business plan. Aside from the ethics and morals of it, it's just not a wise way to do business. And I think that it damages morale among workers, and it's just an unfair way to treat them. So I think that the conversations we had were very fruitful, and we did have a number of major national companies that agreed.
My former employer.
Exactly, that agreed to stop using on-call shifts.
So I'm going to ask you, in the last 30 seconds here, we've seen a lot of heat around car washers in Brooklyn, around low-wage people, delivery folks, people who are working in restaurants. Just in the closing, which person is the most at-risk worker as it stands right now in Brooklyn?
I think you've named some of the key workers that are at risk. I think the workers who are isolated, more than focusing on an industry, the workers who are isolated, who aren't in contact with an organization, who are limited English proficient, those are the workers, I think, who are most at risk and who all of us have to really make sure to focus on in protecting their rights.
All right, Terri Gerstein, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.